I've been becoming more enthusiastic about short stories in general for about 3 or 4 years, because I judged a couple of competitions and begun to write my own and then began reading them. And I was actually invited by Head of Zeus to put together a very personal collection of short stories by women. And it was just the nicest gift, really, to be asked to do such a lovely project, and I didn't think twice about it. So for the best part of a year, I sat in the London Library and read volume after volume of short story. And what was nice, obviously the London Library is full of other writers, and we all, when we're allowed to, we kind of have whispered conversations and we ask each other what we're doing. So everybody I spoke to in there had a story that I must read or a writer that I must look at. So it kind of snowballed. I had, let's say, the sort of 20 or 30 very obvious names, and then I gathered gradually more and more lesser known names sometimes from friends and colleagues, and followed up everything that people suggested. Didn't always share their taste, which was fine, because if I didn't like a story or I didn't like a writer's tone of voice or their subject matter, then I just had the freedom not to include it. So it is a very personal collection. Sometimes it's the immediacy, the fact that in the first sentence you are absolutely gripped. You are just held, in this vice, the writer's vice, and you've got to see what happens. Sometimes it's that. Other times it's more to do with a mood, because you feel that it's in a sense, it's a little bit self-indulgent sometimes reading a short story. If you look for a story and let's say by Alice Munro, generally you're going to get something probably so upsetting that you may not be able to read anything else for the rest of the day. One or two of hers that I chose for the collection are like that, and you scrape yourself up off the floor. You cannot believe that this tragedy hasn't happened, for example, because they're so real. So sometimes it's a sort of a bit of a desire to wallow in a mood, and maybe you might not want to do that for the whole day, but for an hour or so you'll read a story and it will just sort of fill you up with emotion. And I think the majority of the stories in this collection they're sort of defined by an emotion. I don't tend to go for just plot-driven, stories with a clever twist. There's usually something shocking or moving. There's some humour. I love to be made to laugh by a short story. Something that it's a funny situation, but then something ridiculous happens at the end. They're mostly stories that I don't think people will come away from feeling nothing. They've all made me feel something. I hate generalising about things, because then you get kind of sort of shot at over the parapet. But I think women are better at being very open about their emotions, generally, in day-to-day life they are. And I think they are on paper as well. Having said that, there are quite a few writers, and certainly a few stories in this collection, that if you took away the author's name, you wouldn't know they weren't written by men. They've adopted a sort of male persona. But generally, I think that women, and the stories I love, are quite emotional, and women will just dive into that sort of the deep end of emotion rather fearlessly. So I'm not saying that makes them better writers of short stories, but they probably write different short stories, let's say from Henry James or Graham Greene. Somerset Maugham, I think, is for me, he's an emotional writer, but not all male writers are. There's a writer called Anna Kavan who, again, very emotional writer. She didn't live to a very ripe age because she was a drug addict. And I hadn't come across her at all before. Maybe had you?
No,
Do you
I've
know?
heard of her name.
Oh,
I haven't
right.
read it.
But really amazing story. I mean, quite, there's one called The Leopard where she has, I mean, I suspect that she wrote it under the influence of drugs, but it's about this sort of leopard that visits her. And then one day he doesn't visit her anymore. And it's quite hallucinogenic, very surreal, extremely beautiful, and incredibly sad. Yeah, so I think she's the sort of my personal discovery in the collection. I adore Nicola Barker. She's completely in her own sphere for me. Generally very funny, and they're quite short. So if you were like looking for something perhaps that you were going to read on a short underground journey every day, she would be the one, because I find her immensely cheering because she's so funny. So I think, gosh, different kinds of journey, but I think if I wanted something to go on the tube in the morning when I just wanted to kind of not be, annoyed by people crushing me or treading on my feet, if I was immersed in a Nicola Barker story, I would be very happy. Whereas Alice Munro, I'd probably arrive at work, still sobbing, still trying to recover. So she'd be a different kind of a journey. I've, having written a book of short stories of my own, I got very addicted to those, and I've had to, in a way, go a bit cold turkey on my short story writing, although I am still writing some. But I'm stopping because I have a deadline on my next novel, which I hope will be out next year, which has another Greek theme. So I'm very immersed in that at the moment. But definitely now I've started writing short stories, I'm still gathering for for the future. So my brain is still a little bit involved in the short story writing, but my sort of frontal part of my brain and my hands are writing a novel.